The Blackwood family, a Pennsylvania Gothic asterisk, the year 1823 found America in a state of tumultuous adolescence. The Erie Canal was a raw, muddy gash across New York, and the young nation was stretching its limbs, pushing westward into territories still whispered about in the parlors of Philadelphia and Boston. In Pennsylvania, beyond the refined cobblestones of its growing cities, lay a different world. Here, in the dense, old-growth forests of the Allegheny Plateau, communities were isolated. Life was hardscrabble, and superstition clung to the shadows between the towering pines like mist. It was in this landscape of isolation and inherent darkness that the legend of the Blackwood family and their funeral home of horrors is set. The Blackwoods were not newcomers to the region. Ezekiel Blackwood, the family patriarch, was a man whose lineage in the area was as deep and twisted as the roots of the hemlocks that surrounded their property. He was a man of severe countenance, with eyes that seemed to have absorbed the perpetual twilight of the woods. His wife, Prudence, was a silent, pale woman who spoke rarely and whose movements were as quiet and precise as a settling shroud. They had 3 sons, Abel, Caleb, and Silas, each bearing the same grim demeanor and formidable physicality. Their enterprise, if it could be called that, was not a funeral home in the modern sense. In 1823, the professional undertaking industry was in its infancy. Most communities cared for their own dead. However, the Blackwoods offered a unique and, to some, a divinely sent service. Ezekiel was a skilled carpenter, and his finest products were his coffin's sturdy, well-constructed boxes of oak and pine, sealed against the elements. Furthermore, the family possessed a large, horse-drawn wagon, a rarity and a necessity for transporting the deceased from remote homesteads to the often distant churchyard. Their property was the perfect location for such a macabre business. Their cabin, built of dark timber and stone, sat at the end of a long, muddy track that could scarcely be called a road. It was flanked by a large workshop, from which the constant sound of sawing and hammering echoed, and a smaller, windowless outbuilding made of fieldstone, always kept locked. The whole clearing was perpetually shaded, cold, even in high summer, and visitors spoke of an unnatural quiet, broken only by the cawing of crows and the family's industry. The Blackwoods became a necessary evil for the scattered settlers. When a fever took a child, when a farming accident claimed a father, or when winter pneumonia quietly stole an elder's last breath, someone would make the grim journey to fetch the Blackwoods. They would arrive with solemn efficiency. Ezekiel and his sons would handle the body with a cold, professional detachment, while Prudence would comfort the bereaved with words that were scripted and hollow, yet soothing in the raw immediacy of grief. They would offer to prepare the body, build the coffin, and provide transport for a single, comprehensive fee, often paid in goods or promised labor, welcome relief for families drowning in sorrow. For years, their service was accepted as a grim part of the frontier cycle of life and death. The disappearances were explained away. A lone traveler heading west, surely lost to the wilderness or to wolves. A trapper who never returned from his line. The river, or an animal, had claimed him. An itinerant preacher moving through the area. He had simply moved on to his next congregation. The wilderness was a hungry, anonymous place. The first cracks in this facade appeared subtly. A family who had lost their daughter to consumption insisted on keeping her locket. Prudence Blackwood assured them it would be placed with her in the casket. Months later, during a chance encounter in town, their surviving son saw a strikingly similar locket hanging from the neck of Silas Blackwood's young wife. When confronted, Silas merely stared, his face a stony mask, and said, "You are mistaken. It is a common design." The family, unnerved and without proof, dropped the matter, but the seed of dread was planted. The true horror of the Blackwood operation was not discovered by a posse or a sheriff, but by a boy. Samuel Miller, a curious 12-year-old from a neighboring farm, had been dared by his friends to sneak onto the Blackwood property to see the ghosts they claimed lived there. While hiding in the brush, he watched as the Blackwood brothers returned with their wagon. This time, however, they did not carry a coffin into the workshop. Instead, they dragged the body of a roughly dressed manna peddler, by the look of his pack, into the stone outbuilding. Samuel, terrified but fascinated, waited until nightfall. Through a crack in the mortar of the stone shed, he saw a scene from a nightmare. The interior was not a storage space, but a butcher's shop of the damned. The body of the peddler lay on a heavy table. Ezekiel and his sons, stripped to their waists and gleaming with sweat in the lantern light, were not preparing a body for burial. They were dismembering it with practiced, efficient strokes of their carpentry tools. Abel was carefully sorting through the man's clothing and possessions, setting aside anything of value. Caleb was sectioning the flesh. Silas was scrubbing bones clean in a large tub. Nothing was wasted. The useful items were added to a growing trove of stolen goods. The biological matter had other, unspeakable uses. The Blackwoods had discovered a grisly, sustainable economy. Their funeral service provided a perfect cover for their true vocation: predation. They would identify vulnerable travelers or isolated individuals, often those with no kin in the area. Sometimes, they would even hasten death itself. visiting the sick and elderly with tinctures that were not medicine but poison, creating their own clientele. The bodies they were legitimately hired to bury received a semblance of dignity. The bodies of their victims were raw material. The bones, cleaned and bleached, were ground down using a modified grain mill. The resulting bone meal was mixed with the flour they sold or traded in town, a secret ingredient that made their bread strangely white and sought after. The meat, rendered into lard or mixed with animal feed, sustained their hogs, which grew fat and were butchered and sold. Even the hair was saved, to be sold for stuffing upholstery or making wigs. They had created a closed, horrific system where human beings were consumed, and their very essence was converted into profit and sustenance. Their disappearance erased by the wilderness they had vanished into. Samuel Miller fled, his mind shattered by the revelation. He told his parents a hysterical, disjointed story of monsters and butchery. His father, a pragmatic farmer, initially dismissed it as a boy's wild imagination fueled by campfire stories. But Samuel's terror was absolute and persistent. Combined with the earlier story of the locket and the growing, unspoken unease in the community, it prompted the father to finally ride to the next county to speak with the sheriff. The law's arrival was not a dramatic siege. It was a quiet, suspicious visit. The sheriff and 2 deputies found the Blackwoods at their work, as grim and impenetrable as ever. They demanded to see the stone shed. Ezekiel Blackwood unlocked it without a word of protest. Inside, the sheriff expected to find a slaughterhouse. Instead, he found a meticulously clean storage room filled with sacks of flour, sides of bacon, and farming tools. The Blackwoods had been warned. They had scrubbed every surface with lye, hidden their tools, and transformed the space. The sheriff, embarrassed and with no evidence, apologized for the intrusion and left. The Blackwoods knew their time was limited. The suspicion was now a tangible thing. That night, they packed their wagon with their accumulated wealth of jewelry, the coins, the fine fabrics, all stripped from their victims. They set fire to their cabin, the workshop, and the stone shed, creating a pyre that lit up the night sky and could be seen for miles. When the community arrived to fight the blaze, they found only ash and the intense, sickening smell of burning pork, the remains of their own hogs, left in the pens. The Blackwoods vanished into the American night, as anonymous and vast as the wilderness they had used to hide their crimes. They were never seen again. Some said they died in the Western Territories. Others whispered they simply established the same horrific business under a new name in another isolated community. No official record of a serial killer family in Pennsylvania in 1823 exists because the Blackwoods are a fiction. However, their story is a powerful Gothic tale, because it is woven from threads of historical truth. It combines the very real isolation and hardship of frontier life, the nascent and unregulated nature of the death industry at the time, and the timeless primal fear of what might lurk in the dark, lonely places just beyond the edge of civilization. It is a story that feels true because it speaks to a fear that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural but the human beings who live next door, offering a helpful hand and a comforting word, all while hiding an unspeakable hunch.